Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smoko podcast. My name is Alexis Armstrong, your host. Nice to meet you. The Smoko podcast is the place to celebrate and highlight women, trans women, and non binary folk working within STEM and trade occupations. So please tune in, take a break, and join us. We are on Smoko. And today we are joined by a lovely person, soon to be Dr. Tam Tham, who is a scientist. She studies small scale protein interactions. She's at Dalhousie University right now, completing her PhD, and we're going to talk a little bit about her research. But she also is the director of youth engagement for SCWIST, which is the Society for Canadian Women in Science and Technology. And Tam was very kindly mouthing the words to me because I am probably going to have a hard time pronouncing that. But SCWIST is one of the largest nonprofit organizations in Canada that specializes in improving the presence and influence of women and girls in STEM. They've been around since 1981, and they promote participation and advancement through education, networking, mentorship, partnerships, and advocacy. They work with governments on policy and education, and they do basically a fantastic job. They are absolutely amazing. It's a huge honor to have soon to be Dr. Tam Tham on the show. I can't wait to talk to her. I can't wait to have this conversation and talk about the program and also talk about youth engagement. A lot of our conversation today is going to be surrounding how to increase the representation of minority communities within STEM and also how to increase the representation of youth engagement within STEM. So, Tam, thank you so much for coming on the show. It is so nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. I'm so happy and honored to be here.
Honestly, like the honor is mine. I think that what you do is pretty incredible, and I can't wait to have this conversation. And maybe to start us off, if we could start at the very beginning, because your research and your specialty, it's characterizing and understanding small protein interactions, which I don't really understand what that actually means. And before we get into the nitty gritty of your specialty, I was wondering if you could talk to like how did you get there? What was that path in becoming a protein interaction specialist? How did that happen, Tam? If you could kind of walk through that story.
Oh, if I have to go through that, that could be a whole essay. But but to keep it brief and short, I started out as an undergrad in biochemistry. I was doing a specialist in biochemistry at the University of Toronto. The gist of the program is it's either you get to pick the double major or you do the specialist part, and I ended up doing specialist, but then I didn't really like it because I felt like it was just too nitty gritty into biochemistry, and there was not a lot of like application to like the real world. And I'm more of a, I feel like I like to see the stuff that I do research in
Hmm.
having application somewhere. And I also recognize that there has always been like a low representation of trans and queer folks in within STEM. Plus I'm also disabled, so that's also added another layer of like barrier right there. So it wasn't really like something that I enjoy in the beginning.
Mm.
Let's just be real,
Yeah.
academia is ableist.
Yeah. A hundred
Very,
percent. Yes, it is. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
very ableist. Queer phobia and transphobia often don't get talked enough, but it does exist. Oftentimes, it's being talked behind the doors. So
Yeah.
people we would gossip at you and stereotypes and all that stuff. But ableism is definitely the thing that always happened, and it's really hard. So I wasn't really doing great in specialist program for the sheer fact that
Oh.
I asked for accommodation needs
Yeah.
and I just didn't get that. They deny that. They believe that my accommodation needs was not a good justify reason.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and no, it's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it's a reality for a lot
Hmm.
of folks within the program, within university settings.
Yeah.
Yes, I wasn't able to get that accommodation. So I felt like, okay, specialist program didn't really work for me. So I switched over to do a double major. And I ended up meeting my supervisor, my ex supervisor at that time, Dr.
Oh,
Deborah Zample, who is a wonderful researcher, a women
amazing.
in STEM
Yeah.
specialist in nickel binding protein. She is an amazing woman. She inspired me in so many level, and she's cross appointed with both
Mm.
chemistry and biochemistry department. So I worked under her for my honors project. And
Oh,
I ended up
fantastic.
feeling inspired. And I was like, you know what? I want to do double major in biochemistry and chemistry too. I just feel inspired.
Okay.
And it's like oftentimes when you hear these stories, you meet a
Hmm.
certain person that inspire you. And she was the first woman in STEM that truly inspired me. Obviously, the other one is my mom.
Oh,
But
that.
my mom has no training, right? She's a first generation immigrant. So
Hmm.
my mom never has any educational training in North
Hmm.
America. So her experience is vastly different from mine.
Yeah.
But yeah, like my mom and Deborah have always been those
You
two
too.
that inspire
Yeah.
me. Deborah just recently passed away in 2020. But yeah, it definitely left a huge impact on me. The words, the encouragement,
Hmm.
the inspiration that I draw
From her.
from majority of my work is often come from her,
Oh,
which is amazing.
that is amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, like I ended up feeling inspired. I was doing research with her work. She works in nickel metal ion binding protein. So
Okay.
I was doing research in that.
Ah.
One cool thing about that research is I have to use a biophysical technique called NMR, nuclear magnetic
Oh.
resonance.
Oh, that's different. Okay. That's kind of
Yeah.
cool. Very
Yes.
specialized. Like
Yeah.
specialized niche topic, but then specialized like methodology as well. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
Mm.
So I prepare the protein, I label it, and then I collect the data from NMR. I unfortunately I couldn't get to the NMR collection step because I was
Mm.
an honor student, and putting
Yeah.
an honor student, undergrads into deal
No.
with $1 million instrument, not a good idea.
No, not for you. Not yet. Maybe a
Yeah,
PhD and then we'll talk. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So I wasn't able to get access to the facility, but I learned a lot from that
Mm.
experience. I learned so much, and it inspired me. And then I decided, you know what, I wanna be back to Maritimes because I'm from Maritimes. I'm
Yeah.
actually from New Brunswick. I'm from St. Paul,
Oh,
New
amazing.
Brunswick. Yeah,
I love it. Love
yeah.
it.
And I wanted to come back to Maritimes because I feel like family is important for me.
Hmm.
Like I have been away from my family for many reasons, for undergrads,
Hmm.
conflicts and all that stuff. And I wanted to be back. I wanted to be near them. I wanted to like just be in a place where I feel comfortable with, like my
Oh,
own home.
totally. Yeah.
So I
Especially if
decided,
like, sorry, I was about to say, especially if like academia isn't really is ableist and also not really designed for you, that completely makes sense to be like, you know what, I'm going to take some control out of my situation and I'm going to go home and I'm going to
hmm
find an environment that's comfortable for me. Like that makes total sense. I would have
yeah,
done the same thing. Yeah.
yep, yep. That's exactly what I did. I applied to Dalhousie,
Mm.
and like it's in Halifax, so it's obviously it's not in New Brunswick, but at
Close
least it's
enough
a
though.
4 hours drive,
Yeah.
so I can see my family once in a while.
Yeah.
It's not gonna be like once per year, more so
Yeah.
like twice or I don't know, once
What have you?
per
Yeah.
2 3 months or something. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot more control in terms of like mental health in general, like being
Yeah.
able to see my brother who is very
Oh.
supportive, see my parents, and hang out and connected with my family. I guess I'm a very family oriented type person, so
Yep.
it works out
Yeah.
for me. It
Yeah.
works
No,
out for my
totally.
mental health.
Yeah, totally. Like
Yeah.
I feel you completely on that. Like I'm a very family oriented person and I'm so sorry to hear that you went through that and that academia has that culture because I do think that that's
hmm
something that maybe if you're not part of the LGBTQIA plus community or if you're not trans or if you're not disabled, you maybe don't know that the academic culture can be like that and can
Yeah.
be ableist. And I'm so sorry that
hmm
you experienced that, but I do love that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that was Deborah. And I love her impact in your
Yeah.
story because I think
Yeah.
sometimes all you need is one person. Like you just need one person in your corner, and like your life can completely transform. Like that
hmm
happened with me. I met Sarah. She was the first woman in STEM. Sarah and Sandra, those were my two. They were the first women in geology that I met. And I remember the
hmm
moment that they walked in the classroom, and I was like, well, I guess that's what I'm going to do. Like, I'm going to become a
hmm
geologist. Like, it really
Yeah.
does make a difference. And I love that aspect of your story. I think that's a very
hmm
beautiful thing. And I'm sorry for
Yeah.
your loss. I'm sorry she passed.
Yeah. It was really sad when I heard the news from my supervisor.
Mhm.
That was that was a moment where I reflected a lot. I think it happened during the time of COVID lockdown as well. It feels like there were just so much mourning at that time, at that period, that I wasn't able to really like process through.
What was
Not
happening?
until later on when I realized that okay, I just lost somebody who has made such a big impact in my life. Even though I only worked with her for a year as an honor student, she
Yeah.
inspired me.
Yeah.
And when I got my first publication, it was not even first author. I sent it
Yeah.
immediately to her. I
Yeah.
was like, please
I did
read
it.
through this.
Yeah.
Deborah, please. Like I know it's not nothing big. I'm only a fourth author, but
Still.
this is my work. It's
Yeah.
something that if I only get published, can you
Yeah.
please take a look at it?
A
And
hundred
it was
percent. Yeah, like your work, like it exists because of her, and like you followed in her footsteps and you took her specialty, and like I think that's going to be a really beautiful thing that you can pass on her legacy and pass on
mhm,
her name, and like she's always going to be part of your story, and like through your research, you can be like, yep, this was inspired by Deborah. Like I'm getting now this first person author
mhm.
paper because of her.
Yeah. Afterwards, I got drafted by my other supervisor, Dr. Jane Rainey. Now he's an NMR
Okay.
specialist. He also used NMR to study protein as well. So he
Oh.
got me drafted into his project where I use 19-fluorine
Oh.
to put label on small little peptides and
Cool.
look at how it interact with the cell membrane and
Awesome.
potentially coming up with a mechanism on how these peptides function.
Okay. That's
So
really cool.
stay tuned for the publication because I just submitted my manuscript 2 weeks ago. So
Congrats. That's amazing.
it's under review right now. So finger crossed.
Oh, it'll get into it. It'll be perfect. Maybe that's the perfect segue into our second one is
Yeah.
just diving in a little bit to your research. And if we could define some things if people are not within the protein world, could you kind of talk a little
Hmm.
bit about like what you're actually studying in terms of like interest and importance? Why are you so passionate about proteins? Like what is it about these peptides that you're like, yep, we have to study it? And then like what are
Hmm.
the role of those peptides in the bigger scientific community or like the bigger picture of what you're trying to study and what you're trying to
Mm.
focus on?
There are many fun things about peptides that you can
Okay.
do. I can go on and on, but I'll keep it brief and short. So, cool thing about peptides is that, well, in general, proteins are fun. They're fun molecules. You can visualize them. They have different conformations, have different foldings, and each of those conformations can have different function.
Okay.
So
Kind of cool.
usually when you relate to diseases, you relate to, like any genetic disorder, it oftentimes get traced back to
Protein.
proteins, some kind of
Really?
issue in protein expression. Some
That's
kind
crazy.
Yeah, so either the upper end where the process of protein being made were tamper,
Hmm.
or when the protein was processed or was made, it was not properly processed, right? There are also other conditions outside of protein landscape as well.
Hmm.
Like you have diseases and anything that relate to transcriptome, so like
Hmm.
RNA, mRNA, RNA type of diseases. But protein is very highly relevant. Yeah,
I didn't
protein is
know that. I
highly
had no
relevant.
idea. Tim, that's really cool. And like, is that across all diseases? Like, protein is
It's
highly relevant in all
Yeah,
expression of disease.
in a lot of different conditions and a
Wow.
lot of different diseases, proteins play a huge role, just in sheer fact that protein regulate how your body function. Let's say I can give an example. When you're under stress, when you're in the cold environment, your body will obviously produce more cold resistant type of proteins, right, to help you cope with the changes.
Cool.
When you're under heat shock,
Hmm.
there will be a lot more expression of heat shock protein,
That's
right?
awesome.
So it's quite relevant in whatever context that you're in. Obviously, there are exceptions. There are always
Hmm.
exceptions everywhere else, but I find that they're cute little molecules. Their images are beautiful. I'm in for the aesthetic as well.
Well,
You can
duh.
tell.
Every single scientist is. It always comes down to like, I think they're really cool. They look awesome under a microscope. They're really cute. Like it always comes down to that.
Yeah, the structure are fun and they're
Mhm.
dynamic. They move around. They don't stay in one conformation. There are some highly, rigid type of proteins, but the small
Mhm.
peptides are very dynamic. So they are, in a way, we call them intrinsically disorder. They're
Oh,
mostly
okay.
very disorder. They travel everywhere and they appear in a lot of cells in human bodies. One example I can give you is insulin. It's a hormone
Okay.
peptide.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
It's a
I
hormone
forgot
peptide.
about that. Yeah, that
Yeah.
is true.
It's very
That's
small. It's very
yeah.
dynamic, but yet it's super potent, right? It's
Yeah.
very bioactive. It does a lot of cool things, and we all know what it does. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So are you studying kind of the movement of these peptides? Are you studying like the formation of them, of where they are in the body? What is your research looking at when you're looking at these peptides?
My research is actually looking at the conformational and dynamics of
Okay.
these hormone peptides. Specifically, I look at abelin, which is
Okay.
a type of hormone peptides that's involved with the formation of blood vessels. Yeah.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah.
That's very important. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
you need those. That's fantastic.
And the cool thing is when you learn one set of hormone peptide,
Mm,
it kind of translates to the other hormone peptides because they all have similar way of
mm.
binding, right? Like
Okay.
at least with the G protein couple receptor class
Type.
that I'm
Yeah.
type that I study. If you understand how one peptide bind to another receptor, you have a good idea of how the other might bind to the receptor.
Mhm.
And that's the cool part. It's translatable. It's very relevant. And basically, the paper that my manuscript that I just submitted a few weeks ago was looking at why it binds to cell membrane
Mm.
before it actually binds itself to the receptor.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah, it's already translatable because a lot of these hormone peptides have the potential to bind to the cell membrane before it binds to the receptor.
Oh,
So,
that's really cool. That's
yeah.
awesome that like that then impact into the bigger scientific community, other people who are studying different peptides, like maybe within the same class or maybe even within a different class, they can use your research and be like, okay, well, we can look at this one protein and we can
Mhm.
kind of, if this behavior, the way that this acts here, we can now trace it for this and we can use it for a different area of medicine.
Mm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. And
Very
you can
cool.
tweak it. You can play around with these peptides and make them into materials,
Oh, wow. They're so
biomaterials.
dynamic then. Like you
Yeah,
can make them completely into biomaterials. That's really, really cool,
yeah,
Tam. That's fantastic
yeah,
research. Oh,
yeah,
I love that. I
yeah.
absolutely love
The
that.
field of peptides is fun. It's fun because it's very, human compatible, biocompatible. So it can be tweaked to be biomaterial to use as matrices into the cells. It's great. And then also it's big enough that it has a good amount of bioactivity. When if you add like, a chemical compound, sometimes that's not enough to induce some kind of like
Mhm. Reaction or something.
reactions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Physiological response. Yeah.
Mm. But this can like create kind of anything and they're like building blocks almost. I feel like proteins are definitely building blocks of you can take it anywhere. Well,
Yep.
that's very cool. Congrats on the manuscript that will be published very soon. I know it.
I hope so
That's
too.
I will, 100% will. I'm
Thank you.
manifesting it for you. Tam, I would love to spend more time here and to talk about this because it's so interesting. But it's crazy because you have like pure science and you're doing your PhD. You're honestly doing like a crazy amount of stuff, but then you're also doing scientific communication. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that and that transition. Like, how
Mm,
did that happen that you were like, you know what, I'm going to move from pure academia and science to science communication? What
hmm.
has been the most surprising aspect of that transition? And then what has been the most fulfilling aspect of that transition into science
Mm.
communication?
So we would have to rewind back to April 2022. I met two other women who are also in STEM, two amazing scientists. I met Dr. Christine Beats. She is currently the Dean of Faculty of Science at U Calgary,
Oh, cool.
and she was presenting about, well, basically her whole presentation, and this is at a conference, it's at CSMB, Canadian Society for Molecular Biosciences. So she was presenting her work, but then she's segueing uh, into a completely different topic, which is science communication.
I love
And I was like,
it.
okay,
What?
okay, where is this going?
Yeah.
But this is great. I'm in for it. So then she started talking about how we scientists need to go out to the world. We need
Mhm.
to stop
Agree.
living in the lab. Like we need to stop just focusing on producing results and making things. We also need to go out there to the world and communicate our
Mhm.
science. And we need that because especially during that time, I believe, we just started lifting COVID restriction. And she was talking about how the public needs to understand
What's happening?
science. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, the science behind, vaccine, the science behind COVID, why we are in the state we are, climate
Mhm.
change. The public needs to know this, but
I
they're
agree.
losing trust. There's such a huge distrust nowadays from the public to STEM sectors and to scientists. She was very passionate about it. I was like, "Atta girl, like I'm in for it." I was invested. Let's just
Yeah.
put it that way.
You're like, I
And I
got you.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and the moment I listened to it, I was like,
Mhm.
I wanted to do science communication. And I feel like it's also coming from a selfish place in a way because I have always experienced the struggle of like,
Mhm.
when you attending certain seminar and they're just using all these big jargon words and you just don't understand what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But when you actually look up what these jargon words
It's
mean,
simple.
they're
Yeah.
simple concept.
Yeah.
They're just being, like crafted
Smart.
into this,
Yeah.
yeah, into this inaccessible language, I would call
Yeah.
it. When she was talking about it, I relate back to those moments where I felt like I was the dumb kid in the class for asking all these questions because I don't know what these terminology mean.
Yeah.
When in fact I know the concept, I understand it, I can wrap my head up around it.
Yeah.
But it's just the way science would deliver was not accessible.
Mhm.
And I realized that, you know what? I can see myself doing this because I know how it feels to be that disabled kid that
Mhm.
couldn't get what this jargon means, that have a hard time reading through, text because I'm dyslexic as well.
Yeah.
So it just everything just kind of clicked together, and I was like, I'm down for this new insight, I guess,
Yeah.
in science communication. And
Oh, I love that.
since then, I kind of just branch myself into science communication. I still do my research, but
Mhm.
I feel like science communication has been sort of like the greater mission, I guess, for me,
Yeah.
because now I'm focusing on making it accessible, making it a lot easier for youth, for people with intellectual disability, people who
Yeah.
don't have that education of like post-secondary level
Totally.
education
Yeah.
to be able to understand, because
What's going on?
they deserve to
Oh,
know what that means.
well, like science is like crucial. I couldn't agree more. Tam and I love that you met this other amazing woman and that she influenced you and that you were like, yep, okay, this is now like the second part of my calling and I'm going to add this onto my research. I think that's pretty beautiful. And like you could tell that this is a passion from just like researching you. I was like, oh my goodness, they're incredible. Like all the work that you do is just insane. So
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with like science communication and needing it because what I always go to and what I always think of, I'm disabled as well. I have ADHD and I was in French immersion as a kid. And my parents were just like, you need to learn both languages. But we didn't really know that I had ADHD at the time and that maybe
Mm.
like French was a little bit too difficult. Maybe English was hard enough and like reading was hard enough, let alone French. But
Mm-hmm.
I always remember with the jargon and the inaccessibility of science, trying to learn it in French and trying to learn it in a different language and just
Mm.
having no clue what was going on. And it was so inaccessible. It was so hard to understand. There were so many big words. Then all of a sudden it was spoken in my language in grade 11. It switched. And I was like, oh, that's what you guys have been talking about for the last like 3 years. Like, oh, I got that. That's easy. Like, I understand it now. Like, it would just took that little step down. And I always go back to the language part of it because I do also think that the way that we communicate predominantly in English, predominantly in heavy jargon English, it is so limiting. And we don't have this kind of common basis. Like, if English was my second language, I don't know if I could go into science.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know half the words in English, let alone like it's too jargony, it's too big. I couldn't agree more with breaking it down and bringing it to the public because science is
Mm-hmm.
fundamental to every single person's life and they deserve it, especially in times like this right now with like maybe unknowns like climate change and things that can actually affect them. They deserve to know what's happening in their community. So
Yeah.
I absolutely love that transition. I couldn't agree more. And if we could speak to your work currently as Director of Youth Engagement, because you mentioned that you're trying to bring in accessibility
Mhm.
within science communication and within public understanding, but you're also trying to bring in the younger generation of scientists into the community. And I was
Mhm.
wondering if we could explain kind of your role as Director of Youth Engagement in relation to SCWIST's larger mission, and maybe take a little bit of time to explain the organization if those are kind of unaware of the
Mhm.
organization.
Yeah, for sure. SCWIST, the organization that I'm working with and hoping to bring in accessibility for. So the society is basically Society for Canadian Women in Science and Technology. So what that means is we're focusing on inclusion and equity and accessibility, different aspects of STEM that often excluded to marginalized community, specifically to women. And I think the big mission and in the way we carry our goal at the nonprofit organization level is how can we address systemic barriers towards women, towards other marginalized community. Even though we say women, we really mean like
Yeah.
inclusive, like in any single
Everybody.
aspect. Yeah,
Hmm.
everyone who are affected by patriarchy, by misogyny
Yeah.
within STEM. We have different directors who are involved with
Hmm.
different type of programmings that we deliver. My role is to be the director of the youth engagement. So I deal mostly with the youth, which is a very fun, very uplifting role, I would say. Just because I enjoy science communication. And for me, working with youth, you know, it will bring joy to them. You get to know that your work will make the biggest impact in the
100%.
next generation of potential scientists, right? So it's great. We also have directors who are involved with the women's program, who are the women's program in our organization is mostly towards women who potentially have to leave STEM sector
Hmm.
due to the leaky pipeline situation.
Hmm.
And we're trying to retain them. We're trying to really creating opportunities and educational resources, providing toolkits to help them stay and keep doing what they love to do, which is
Yeah.
being in STEM. There are also other aspects of our programs as well. There's the policy side, which
Hmm.
our president, Melanie Ratnam, she's been the champion of that side, working towards one of the pillar is working toward gender-based violence addressed within the STEM sectors. So that is also another really important key piece in our most recent strategic planning at SCWIST. So there are many projects, there are many things we
No.
we work towards, but you can see that the theme is to really advance equity, to really make STEM as inclusive
Hmm.
as possible and
Yeah.
accessible as possible, right? One last thing I just wanted to add is the fact that I don't get to do the operational side in
Mm.
the sense that I don't get to, go out to the field
The
to high
community.
school, yeah, to high
Yeah.
school students and engage them in science. And I deal mostly from within, from the strategic end. So
Hmm.
looking at how we can improve the programs better. So there's also disappointment in my end a little bit because I
Oh,
want like to work and
be with the
see more,
community.
yeah, with the
Yeah.
communities. I know that each of these youth engagement programs that we have needs somebody who is visionary, who is able
Hmm.
to see the long term
Hmm.
aspect and who is able to be connected with their own communities at the
Yeah.
grassroots level. So that's why I'm stepping into this role as I'm
Yeah.
seeing that there is a need for somebody with my experience, my understanding in accessibility. In being a disabled person, I'm always about advocating for accessibility for disabled communities, for
Mm.
honestly for BIPOC community, for any communities that are
Yeah.
in need of that. So I think me coming in was a nice transition in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. I honestly think that like you couldn't ask for somebody better and like somebody more experienced, and also to have that like long term big picture strategy and to be the director of it and to be like, okay, where are we going and what does the community need and what does accessibility look like, and
Hmm.
having that lived experience. Like, I don't love that you've had that lived experience of oppression and problems within STEM and
Hmm.
within academia, but you've lived it and you know what the community needs and where our gaps are, and how we can increase youth representation. And I think what you guys do at SCWIST is just absolutely fantastic. And I
Mm-hmm.
love all of the programs and all of the pathways that you guys do. Again, I think that there's no negatives in this program. I think
Mm-hmm.
the work that y'all do is just bar none.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if we could maybe take a moment to talk about where we are currently with youth engagement and equity in STEM, and why we need more use in science. Like, what is the mission there? What is our kind of
Mm.
current standing? Like, why is
Mm.
this so important to the community? Why is this something that we need?
Mm. Oh dear. You're gonna get me so riled up. There are many reasons why we should care about youth engagement, especially in STEM, especially minority groups. I'm going to be very honest that the
Please.
issue with the public distrust in science, I'm going to circle back to that because
Yeah.
I think that's very important to bring it up. The public distrust to science is because they don't have enough exposure to science, right?
Mm.
And what is the best way, the easiest way for anyone to be exposed to science usually would be through the education,
Mhm.
mostly from the elementary, secondary, up to post-secondary education. But we know that not that many people would ended up going to post-secondary education because let's be real, it's expensive.
Yeah. Yes,
um,
it's too expensive. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
let's be real. So, what would be the best way to expose the public to science via youth engagement, promoting science through school to secondary up and elementary? And to be honest, I have seen some argument saying that we should expose our children, our kids, youth even during kindergarten
I
as
agree.
soon as they can. There has been a lot of old school thinking, I would call it, saying that they don't believe in exposure to STEM during pre-K period. But in my opinion, the sooner you can get them familiar and acquainted with science, with STEM, the easier it is to introduce more complex issue. Because now when we get at the politics level, you have all these people who are going to make really big decisions and they need to be exposed to science in general. So that's just the bigger picture, right? Why I think it's important is because as a minority, I can bring in my own living experience. I'm definitely on a more privileged end in the sense that like I was able to receive education. I was able to attend post-secondary education. But I have heard tons and tons of story within my community where family just couldn't
Mhm.
get their kids to get the education that they want because of so many barriers.
Mhm.
That includes discrimination, ableism, queerphobia, transphobia, and financial, just
Yeah,
financial barriers.
cost
Yeah,
barriers as well.
just simple as that. It dawns on me that the more, I guess, intersectional your identity is, the more likely you won't be able to be exposed to science. Like for me, I talk to a lot of folks who are immigrants. And I'm a first generation immigrant. I came to Canada at the age of 15. I can tell you that it's really hard to get the people from my community to be like excited about STEM, to be like, oh, I wanted to do a career in STEM. Most of the time, even if you wanted to, maybe for Southeast Asian community, they put a lot of emphasis on getting a STEM career. But if you're on a lower income and being an immigrant, you can forget about pursuing an
No,
education in
no.
STEM sector because it's
Yeah.
expensive. And
Yeah.
the thing is, you volunteer hours and hours in the lab, you don't get paid.
Yeah. Well, it's long too. Like, that's what I was gonna say. It's like these are also careers too that usually take 2 degrees or 3 degrees. Like, it's usually that you're not making a stable income until you're like mid 30s if you're doing a full PhD and maybe
Hmm.
a postdoc way, right? Like, if you have to be a really specialized field, which unfortunately a lot of people are now treating a master's degree as if it's an undergraduate or as if it's
Oh
a high
gosh,
school diploma. And I'm like, that
I
is
hate
so
that.
limiting. I hate it too. Like, it's such a privilege to go to higher education and to go to grad school, and it takes so much time, but it also takes so many years that you're out of the working force. And if you come from a lower income family or a lower income situation, you can't
Hmm.
take that much time out of your life to not make a regular salary. Like, it's a very
Yeah.
privileged position to go to grad school unless you're in on bursary. But let's also be real, bursaries have dropped significantly since the 1970s. I remember my dad was like, I got in on scholarship because my dad, he was the first in his family to go to university, and he grew up with not much but it cost him from $2,000 to go to university to do a science degree, and it was completely covered because he got straight A's in high school. That doesn't
Mm.
happen anymore. There's no
Oh
like
no.
no one gets a full ride
I
scholarship. There's
wish that
no
would
way.
have been. I wish that
Yeah,
would have been
but that's not a
the
thing.
current thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but that's not a
exactly.
thing. And,
Yeah.
and he got that bursary because he was from a lower income
Hmm.
class, but that also doesn't exist anymore. And if it does, the bursary is like $500 or $700. Like it's not
Hmm.
going to cover anything in comparison. So
Hmm.
sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but I
Oh.
couldn't agree more. I just think that like it's so there's so many barriers to entry right now to science, and I think the
Hmm.
way that it's set up and the way that some of these jobs in academia is set up, it's
Hmm.
really hard to get youth to come in to agree
Hmm.
to it. You're narrowing the population to a very privileged sector,
Hmm.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we really wanted to cover all the youth, even at graduate and postdoc level, the funding was still not enough
Hmm.
for these folks to be able to live sustainably. Living expense, let's be real,
Yeah.
inflation has been going on for many years, and yet the funding has always been the same for past 20 years.
Hmm.
Right, I can go on and on about support of science mission, all that stuff, the movement to actually increase the funding. But
Hmm.
if it's not that easy to pursue a career in STEM from the master postdoc level, we need to focus at the earlier stage where actually we can encourage more folks who is a lot more accessible and in a
Hmm.
more accessible manner to be able to engage in STEM, right? So I think youth engagement is important,
Yeah.
100%,
Agreed.
and especially minority youths. We know that Black Indigenous folks are often excluded in the conversation when it comes to acceptance to like a graduate level programs. And obviously, it's not just due to discrimination, but also there are other barriers, financial barriers, like yeah,
Yeah.
little nuances. So I think that's why it's so important.
I agree. Thank you very much. Thank you for getting into it. I really appreciate that. And thank you for kind of like walking through each step of it of why it's important and where we are now. Because I think if you're not within sciences or STEM or even maybe like in the education space, I think you just don't know it. And
Hmm.
I couldn't agree more that you do need to bring in STEM education to youth. I think it's so funny when it says like, oh, you don't want to expose kids pre-K to science. They already are exposed to science. Science is in every single day. Why do you think they
Exactly.
wash their hands? Like, why do you think they're playing with dirt? Where does that dirt come
Hmm.
from? Like, it's very easy to bring science into their education.
Hmm.
They're
Yeah.
already scientists. Like, as a kid, you're
Yeah.
so naturally curious.
Hmm.
You're already, I don't know.
And yeah, it's an unfortunate thing to hear that somebody can still have such a old school mindset that is sort of gatekeeping the
Hmm.
opportunity away, especially from minorities. Because like majority of these things, we all know that if you're on the higher income, your chance of exposed to STEM is always going to be
Yeah.
easier.
Yeah.
So by doing this, you're just making it harder for folks on the lower end who don't have a inspiration in their own family who have gone through these kind of education to even show them the way. Yeah.
Have that representation or have that mentorship within it. I had a couple of questions, but I honestly think that we've kind of covered them in the last
Oh.
little bit. Is because the one was like what initiatives are helping, and maybe we haven't talked about there, but I think we have talked about barriers and stop gaps, and we've also talked a
Hmm.
little bit about kind of bias misconceptions, which have created this culture about underrepresentation of minority groups within STEM. I
Hmm.
think that we've talked about that, but maybe the one thing that we have been missing from that conversation and from those questions is what is helping currently? Like, what's your data saying that, like, this is where we should be investing our time because this works and this is bringing more kids into science and more underrepresented people into science? Is there anything that's like a highlight or like a, yep, okay, like keep doing that, keep increasing that?
There are tons of studies about accessibility and how STEM sectors and STEM education can be a lot more inclusive, can
Mm.
be more accessible to the general public. I'll just circle back to one of my encounter with the Canadian Black Scientist Network. It was at the conference. This just happened last week, actually. And the encounter was very informative in the sense that we are seeing a nationwide. Back then, I've mostly seen only little pockets of, initiatives to
Mm.
make science and STEM more inclusive, right? But at this point, we have seen a nationwide call to action to push for more Black inclusion in STEM. And this was very profound. It became even clearer at the conference that I went to. The panel that they were having discussion about was, there was one particular educational engagement associate from
Mm-hmm.
this organization called Vision of Science,
Okay.
and I don't know if you have ever heard of them, but they
No.
have been doing amazing work. They
Amazing.
they involved with a lot of Black youth, and their mission is just to make STEM accessible for Black youth. The speaker, Desiree, she was so passionate about how, for a 3-year-old organization, they're very new, but yet they've done so much great work in engaging with youth, in creating scholarship system, in creating science fair, in creating workshops, like
Oh, amazing.
interactive workshop with these Black youths, and just making it accessible in that sense. From an outsider perspective, it might seem like, oh, this is not going to be sustainable, but it's a very sustainable model the way they
Model.
do it, because now you got all these Black youths who actually will feel inspired, who were more likely to go into STEM sectors. And guess what? Now they can get linked and connect to the
They're
Canadian Black
supported.
Scientists
Yeah.
Network. So we have the Vision of Science Network, we have the Canadian Black Scientists
Mm-hmm.
Network, and
They're
now
linked.
they all link together because it's a nationwide type initiative, right? So they link together, and then guess what happened? So this next initiative is opening career fair,
Yeah.
and they actually bringing in corporates, company, industry, partner, government, every single layers of,
To get them hired.
job, to
Yeah.
get these young Black, well-trained, highly qualified candidates to
Mm-hmm.
be hired.
I
So
love it.
you have this very sustainable model where these folks are now going to get hired and now going to step into those positions, and then they can give back to the community. They can actually go back and engage with Vision of Science and into other initiatives as well. But it's such a cool thing to
Yeah.
hear.
And see working too.
Yeah,
Like not even
yeah.
to hear it, to be like it's
It's
working. To
it's a
yeah.
panel full of folks who are visionary, who just came up with all these pipeline where they streamline the process, they make things easier for Black folks to be able to get into STEM. And that
Oh,
was something that I witnessed. I was like, wow, that's amazing. And
yeah.
then the other side of the panel was a program manager, I think, at MyTex. And now
Okay.
MyTex, I don't know if folks are familiar with MyTex, but they are a industry partner. They linked a lot of these graduates, right, from post-secondary level education, master, PhD, postdoc, whatever, to industry partners. So now we have, like, from a youth, and we have folks from the graduate ends, and then we also have folks that can link them
Mm-hmm.
directly
The next
to
level.
the industry
Mm-hmm.
level, to government level, to different type of nonprofit partnerships as well. It's just really cool. So I think that's one instance where I feel like it actually works out. In terms of SCWIST, working with SCWIST, I have seen folks who receive STEM Explorer. STEM Explorer is one of our youth engagement
Yes,
program.
it is.
When
Yeah.
we go to high school and we have interactive workshop, we have volunteer distribute that out to the teachers, and then we have up to two up to three engagement workshop per year for each of these classrooms. And so these youth that have been engaged with us via STEM Explorer, later on starting to planning for attending our Quantum Leaps conference, and then that led to them getting scholarship, getting
Mm.
opportunities into their graduate level. And it actually really cool to see that some of them ended up coming back and giving back to us and giving back to the community. It's a joy to
Yeah.
see some of this model. In the beginning, it would take time. It's still a work in progress, I do have
Yeah.
to say, but it's going and it's looking pretty bright. Yeah.
Yes, totally. Like it's beautiful to see like an initiative actually working, and it's beautiful to see both your program with the Youth Explorer, but also with their program, to see a baseline being established within the community, because then everybody can be like, okay, well, we've seen it work. We can copy that. We can put it to a different community. We can put it to a different initiative, or maybe a different like geographic area. But we can take that same baseline that we know works and increases representation, and we can copy it, which is just, it's beautiful to see that, because I feel like that's the way that we build on each other and we increase representation. And like that model that you described, it was so beautiful that in every single step they're supported financially, they have scholarship, they're bringing in interest really early, they're getting mentors within their community, they're coming back to their community and giving back. Like it's a beautiful holistic system, and no wonder it's working. And I can't wait to tag vision and to add that to this episode so that everyone can like go and look at those resources and also look at your program as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of accessibility because I think that word has been said a bunch of times, accessibility. And I wanted to maybe ask you to define it in terms of increasing representation of minority communities. So, what is the role of accessibility and what would that actually look like to a minority community? Like, what would be how do we create accessibility? Is it time? Is it funding? How does the rest of the community help and be like, okay, yep, this is what they need. This is what accessibility is defined at. How can we help you guys? And what does that actually look like in practice?
Hmm. A lot of people ask me questions like, what is accessibility and what does it come down to, right? Accessibility in the case of STEM. I mean, before that, we often consider, the term open science, I guess, like
Yeah.
as in like, oh, like science resources and information, knowledge should always be accessible. But I think when you put in the word accessibility, you actually are framing it from the perspective of a marginalized community, right? From the
Mm-hmm.
underrepresented community, because of the historical use of this term in
Mm-hmm.
at least in this disability justice space, a lot of other space as well. But I would often center around disability justice space because that's where we fought the hardest for
Use
that
yeah.
term. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
to be there. In the context of accessibility, what does it mean to minority? I would say it would be the beginning of equity
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that if you hope to achieve
Mm-hmm.
some equitable opportunities among all communities, you would need accessibility first before you can get to that stage.
Equity. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to true equity, right? And because oftentimes minorities, we know how much of a support and a lift that we need to be able to
Mm-hmm.
get to the same level where we would be
Where to
considered,
started.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, to the same starting place as our counterpart. Having accessibility would allow opportunities for us to be able to get to that starting place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that's what I meant by like it is the beginning of equity, right?
Yeah.
Now, what does that look like in STEM space? It can look like in any forms. It all comes down to individual accommodation needs,
Mm-hmm.
I would say. But for me, it looks like the ability that I can participate in STEM space without having to always request for accommodation
Help.
needs.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
already there. It doesn't have to be part of your day to like yell and
Hmm.
shout and to be like, please notice me and please give me what I deserve. It
Yeah.
should already be established. Okay.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
should be like a series of practices that have always been there,
Yeah.
right? And how do we start with accessibility? I would say there are two key things. One is policy that actually address accessibility, that make it a mandate that every single space that we participate in should be accessible
Yeah.
as possible. And I mean, we have already started on that. Canada drafted our Accessible Act in 2022, but has that,
Into come
made it
into
to
practice. Yeah.
education space? Still a long way there. Because it's
Yeah.
up to the university, right? It's up to the educational space to make the call what that accessible plan would look like, right?
Hmm.
So it varies from one institution to another, all that jazz. But I think at the end of the day, you need a policy in place to
Hmm.
push for that. And then the second thing is funding.
Yes. Yeah. You need.
unfortunately,
Yeah.
unfortunately, we need money.
Yes.
Making things more
Totally.
accessible,
Hmm.
it's expensive. If you have the mandate to do it, oftentimes it makes it easier for you to ask for funding. That's why I say like those two things have to come hands
Or
in
one,
hand.
two. Yeah.
Yeah,
Time and
yeah,
resources. The
yeah.
1-2 punch.
Funding
Yeah.
is great, but when it's just funding, but there's no mandate, you can never reach to the level where you will be satisfied with the changes
Hmm.
that you have made with that funding, right? You definitely need
Hmm.
both.
Hmm.
So I think those are the two main things. Obviously, there are other aspects that could make STEM a lot more accessible, like empathy.
Listening, talking to people. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Understanding why somebody would have certain accommodation needs over other. Why somebody would want to have a take-home test instead of
Mhm.
a 2 hour long test. Basically, asking that question that like, what? How can I do to help you? I think that is oftentimes being overlooked in the education space. Like, so most of the time we just focus on dumping down knowledge and just like, he's
Yeah. Go
yeah,
for it. Yeah.
regurgitate all this, right? But it's not how it works. Sometimes you have to understand that you need to be considerate. But I think having a policy and funding, when you have the policy, you can make it really easy to like establish a ground rule,
Enforce.
like,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, and making sure that okay, everybody is on the same page, they get the training to work towards accessible science, but also everybody would then be more mindful and they would actually
Follow
be,
it.
yeah, be
Yeah.
able to strictly follow this footstep. Yeah.
Amazing. No, thank you. And like, because I think that that's almost like an impossible task that I gave you of being like, please define accessibility because it's going to be so nuanced and so like specific to what you're trying to accomplish, the organization, the
Hmm.
community, what issues matter in that
Hmm.
situation, right? And so like I do think that there's not going to be one definition, but thank you for going through it of being like, okay, like what is the baseline of accessibility and what does that look like to increase it, of policy and funding. You've
Hmm.
been so generous with your time, but I do want to ask one really last one. You've done so much work with SCWIST and just with Director of Youth Engagement and just all of this charitable work that you do. It is a hard slog, man. Like there is a lot of things that you guys are fighting against, and it is a very complex, nuanced issue. And you're trying to change culture, which has stayed relatively static for like 50 years,
Hmm.
unfortunately. If somebody is struggling in science communication and in community engagement, because that I think is a very hard job that I think you're going to go through a roller coaster of emotions. So if someone's struggling with it, but they want to really help with community outreach and they're doing something similar to you with increasing representation of minorities in STEM, what would be your advice to them and any kind of words of wisdom for somebody who's within community engagement in a similar position as you?
Take care of yourself.
Okay.
Definitely take care of themselves. I would often call folks who are working on these kind of work that we're doing decolonization type work
Hmm.
in a way, because
Hmm.
improving
You
accessibility
are.
is often,
Yeah.
it's often about knocking down these colonial values and system, right, barriers. So yes, it is a decolonization work, and because of doing so, you're oftentimes going to get burned out. You
Hmm.
oftentimes will experience bureaucracy
Yeah.
delays, and when you work with, especially with policy at the policy level, there will be a lot of pushback. It's often a given. It's
Yeah. It's
no
revolutionary what you
doubts.
guys are doing to society. Like our society is built in a colonial system. So you guys are pushing back against that system. It's going to
Yeah,
be hard. It's going to
yeah.
be really hard.
It's
Yeah.
about to be hard. My
So
biggest advice is pick your battle and choose, and go for that. Don't try to carry all this
the world.
100 years of colonization
Yeah.
and trying to decolonize all of it. Don't try to do that. Pick pick your battle and go
Mm,
for that. Understanding that there are certain things that you can change and there are certain things that you need others to help you to create these changes, right? In terms of science communication work, my advice to folks is empathy. When
mm.
you're connecting to the public, to community, to any stakeholder, even talking to politicians and
Yeah. Whoever.
policymakers, yeah, they are humans at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
knowing what they're interested in, knowing their goal, their mission, their values, can really help be able to bridge the conversation of science to those stakeholders.
Hmm.
It's important to know who your audience is. And
Yeah.
oftentimes when we do science communication workshop, we will always ask the question like, who is
Who are you
your
speaking to?
target audience? Because if you have a very general audience, you're never going to be able to make any point across. So
Hmm.
you need at least a specific amount of community that you wanted to really speak towards, resonate with. And the second advice for that is, if you already know who is your target audience, just focus on those audience.
Mm.
Don't try
Talk to everybody.
to talk to everybody,
Yeah.
because there will always be somebody who would not be happy with the way you communicate to them. That's
Agreed.
the thing
Yeah.
about science communication. It will get lost in translation. It will get
Yeah.
lost in many layers of nuances and social cues and all that stuff.
Jargon, the whole bit,
Exactly.
communication, language, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what I always carry from, like, this is also a model that I carry for myself. Like, if my mission to when I communicate is to make science accessible for disabled community, for BIPOC community, then I think
That's where I'm going.
then that's where I'm going, and queer trans
Hmm.
community, obviously. So like that's where I'm going.
Yeah.
Then those are the community I will focus on. The rest, they can get a piece of that pie, but they
Yeah.
are not going to be the main people that I'm going
Hmm.
to deliver this towards. If they complain, as long as they're not the people within my community, these community that I'm trying to communicate to, then they can keep complaining. It's okay. I'm sorry. This may sound like, like
No, it does.
unbother, but it actually,
No,
it's a very good
it's
way.
good. Hmm.
Yeah. If your target audience is that group of people, focus on them.
Hmm.
Obviously, over time, when you get older, you might change your target audience and all that stuff. That's fair. But make sure you stay clear to that. You know exactly who your target audience, so you don't get bothered by other comments or other people that don't agree with your mission.
Well, I think it goes back to two things. I think it goes back to like that model of like, hey, what works? And it was like a very specific, like for the community, from the community targeted model to be like, this is what we need for our community and this is how we're going to go it. I think it goes back to that targeted approach, but I also think it goes back to what you just said about like, don't get burnt out, try to take care of yourself. And I think if you
Mm-hmm.
go too broad, you are going to be open to a lot more stigma and a lot more like bigotry. And I think you're going to be more open to a generalized view, which might not be as
Mm-hmm.
accepting as your target audience and your target kind of mission. So I think that's fantastic advice. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think it sounds non-bothered. I think it's very, very smart and very good
Mm-hmm.
advice. And
Mm-hmm.
Tam, thank you so much for coming onto the show. This was
Mm-hmm.
a complete joy for me. I feel like I learned so much. I feel like I'm fired up. I absolutely loved that conversation. Just it was an honor speaking with you. Thank you for all the work you do for your community and for the community of women in STEM and trans women in STEM, and just it's fantastic what you do. So thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Oh, thank you for having me here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for just like reaching out to SCWIST. I know some of us are very shy. We're some of our board members are very shy, and I'm one of those like outspoken persons. So I just wanted to raise awareness to the works that we do and the mission of improving equity and representation within the STEM sectors.
Yeah, no, you guys do a fantastic job. I can't wait. I'm going to tag all of your guys' resources, all of your programs, the youth engagement program. I'm going to tag Vision as well, tag
Oh
everyone that we've
yes.
talked about. And just again, thank you for everything that you do. It's absolutely incredible.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
You're
It's been a
welcome.
pleasure.
It's been a pleasure too. And thank you guys for listening. This is the Smoko podcast. We will see you next week. Bye bye.